Welcome to Your Intended Message, the perfect place for leaders and promising professionals who want to convey the intended message for greater success. Every week, we interview experts who can help you communicate more effectively, whether that's one-to-one, one-to-few, or one-to-many. And perhaps the most important conversation, one-to-self. I'm your host, George Torok. Welcome to Your Intended Message. I have two guests today. My first guest is Cheri Torres. Here's 3 facts that I think you should know about Cheri. She is a serial entrepreneur, having started 1 nonprofit and 2 for-profit organizations. 2, she, among other designations, she holds a master's in transpersonal psychology and a PhD in educational psychology. And 3, she likes to enjoy herself hiking in the mountains of North Carolina. My second guest is Jackie Stavros. Here's 3 things I think you should know about Jackie. 1, she is known for creating a program called SOAR. That's a positive approach to strategic thinking, planning, and leading. 2, she has worked in 25 countries, using appreciative inquiry to help thousands of people. And 3, she also enjoys getting outdoors, and it's to explore farmers markets in Missouri.
Actually, Michigan, but that was close.
It's I'm looking MI. I'm thinking, what's MI? Yes. Okay. Thank you for. Okay. It's an M, anyways. Michigan. Silly me. Cheri, Jackie, welcome to Your Intended Message.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be able to share our intended message with you, George.
Yes, thank you. Conversations are all about an intended message.
And most importantly, the 2 of you are here because of the book that you co-authored and is now, I believe, in the 2nd printing. And the book, tell us a little bit about the book, Cheri.
The book is called Conversations Worth Having. And it is, it's focused on the idea that everything we do happens in conversation, whether in conversation with others or in conversation with ourselves. And so if we want to have the outcomes we are hoping for, we need to be careful about the conversations we have. We need to choose to have conversations that move us towards what we want, conversations that invite strong relationships and bring us well-being as well in the way we engage in those conversations.
Now, I'm curious. I imagine that all conversations start with the conversation with ourselves. And I'm also wondering, how much control do we have over those self conversations?
That's a great question, George. I think if you're aware of it, and we're talking about it now, you have an intention to decide, am I going to come into a conversation above the line from an appreciative space, or, am I below the line? And in our book, we talk about the importance of tuning into yourself and simply asking a question, where am I? Am I above the line or that depreciative place below the line? And if you're below the line and you're listening to this, just try this technique to pause, take a deep breath, see how that feels in you, and get curious. And just pausing and breathing gets you to move above the line. It just resets your whole body mindset.
And Jackie, I want to clarify what the line represents.
So imagine a straight line. If you're above the line, that's called an appreciative space where I value you, George. I value the situation that we're in, and I want to add value. So that's appreciation. If you're below that line, you're in that depreciative space where, I may not be valuing you. I may not value the situation. And sometimes if you don't think about your intended message, you could fall, the words can take you below the line. And even if you don't get enough sleep or have enough water, or, just your physiologic can push you below that line. So think about, where am I?
Now, often looking at the self conversations, it's real easy for the self conversation to be below the line, to be depreciative. And the little voice is always saying, well, George, you didn't do that very well, or everyone else is doing better than you, or why can't you do better? And how, can we make that voice go away, or can we somehow add another voice to balance that conversation?
Yeah, I would suggest we don't want to try to make the voices go away, because that just negates ourselves, which is going to make those voices louder. One of the things that I discovered, and I discovered this, I didn't actually, in conversation with some of our other trainers, we've been working on a book called Conversations Worth Having with Yourself. So it speaks directly to what you're talking about, George. And one of the things that someone pointed out is how much of her inner conversation was statement based. So I started paying attention to my inner conversations, and I was always either telling myself what to do or criticizing myself for what I didn't do. Both of those were depreciative. They were below the line. And what I've started doing is asking myself questions, like intentionally. For example, if I want to work a particular exercise into my daily routine by stopping the computer for 8 minutes to do this short routine, I would usually criticize myself at the end of the day when I had not done it, or I would get up in the morning and say, okay, today we're going to do this. And now I've started getting up in the morning and saying, when are you planning on doing this? And what it has done is caused me to put it into my schedule. And so I think just asking yourselves questions, even if it's a negative statement, to say that, is that helpful? What would be more helpful for me to say to myself? And so I think just working in inquiry, the kind of inquiry that actually adds value, that is generative, can help you shift the inner conversation without having to suppress anything.
So I'm seeing that instead of waking up in the morning and say, well, I got to do this, I got to make sure I do that, I got to get that, and I better get this done before noon, I better get going, I got a lot to do. So instead of approaching with that, it might be better to say, well, George, what are you going to do first? Where's a good place to start? What's most important? And if you only got one thing done today, what's the one thing?
Got it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That would be a great solution.
And I know when I go for my morning walk or run, I usually talk to myself, and it's usually out loud. And so I've got more. Now you've just given me more material for more conversations to have on the way. And I suppose, and it's easy if you want to get better. Typically we want to improve. It's easy to criticize oneself. And what can we say instead of criticizing ourselves?
Well, if you go back, George, think about the appreciative space and asking a generative question. It's a question of valuing and asking a question, going back to the where am I? How do I best prioritize my day? What do I want to do? So it's living in that space of valuing yourself and others.
And I suppose we've got to learn to value ourselves while at the same time recognize that we're imperfect.
Yes, there's a saying that if you strive for excellence, it's motivating. And if you strive for perfection, it's demotivating.
Strive for excellence, not for perfection. And most of us, many of us, if it's not ourself saying, you could do better. We've got other people around us who might be nagging at us and saying, well, when are you going to get done? Well, you remember what happened last time? And, look at the neighbors. What are they doing? And look at your brother and look at, your cousins. They're all better than you. So how do we address those outside conversations, those negative outside other people talking to us?
That's a great question. And I think the title of your podcast is a great question to ask those people. When somebody comes at you like that, to ask, what is your intended message? What are you trying to tell me? What is it you're hoping I'm going to get from this? Because usually behind that criticism is a thought or an idea about wanting to inspire you. If you, a parent who says, why can't you do what your brother does? Maybe they think they're trying to inspire you, but instead what you hear is, I'm not as good as, I'm less than. And so being able to have that open conversation of what's your intended message for me? And okay, yeah, I would like to improve. What suggestions do you have for me? What specifically do you think I could do that would make me either more effective or better at, or whatever the intended message is? To really ask those kinds of questions. And Jackie mentioned generative questions. A generative question is one that changes the way people think. And you do that by asking questions that either make the invisible visible, like what's your intended message? I'm going to make the invisible intention visible by asking that question. Or asking questions that create shared understanding. What is it that you would like me to do? Here, can you be specific so I know exactly what you want? And then we're both on the same place, in the same space. We both have a shared understanding. The third thing a generative question does is it generates new knowledge. I wish I could do more of what my neighbor does, but I'm not sure how she does that. Do you know? And now I'm going to gather new information. Or I go interview my neighbor to say, how is it that you're able to accomplish all of that? So I get new knowledge. And then the fourth one, which is often the most fun, is inspiring possibilities. What if you did this? And, imagine that. How would we do that? So it's kind of opening up the door, but all of those kinds of questions literally broaden your view of what's happening. And that changes the way you think about any situation.
Now, Cheri, I noticed some powerful wisdom in there and advice. And what resonated with me is that when we think we're being criticized, that instead of responding in anger or defending or counterattacking, we respond with curiosity.
George, that's exactly right. Get curious. Jackie mentioned that tuning in, that, when we started at the beginning and you were like, well, can we be intentional with our conversations? That and if someone criticizes you, it's normal to feel defensive or like wanting to lash back. But if you pause, that interrupts that pattern, and it also interrupts the biochemical soup that is starting to be dumped into your system. And if you then take several deep breaths, which is what Jackie mentioned, that deep breathing kicks in the parasympathetic nervous system, which further tamps down the cortisol and testosterone. And then getting curious is a positive emotion, which pushes you into the executive functions of the brain, where you can ask a question, you can be intentional with your conversations.
And I just add that there's a magazine behind me that says The Business Case for Curiosity. So Harvard Business Review did an article on the business case for curiosity for business leaders, and you think about their intended messages. And if you were to just look up, Google curiosity, all the health benefits of curiosity. And if you're naturally curious, it's easier and it's more natural. You'll be asking generative questions.
And I'm reminded of my hero, Curious George the monkey. And it sounds like most of us need to enhance, nurture our curiosity. And I'm also guessing that you can't be curious if you're angry.
Right. And that's the importance of pausing and breathing, because Cheri just talked about the neurological effects and the physiological effects. Just if you had a smartwatch on and you saw your smartwatch where your blood pressure is high, your heart rate is high, if you just paused, maybe took 2 or 3 breaths, if you're angry, you'll watch your smartwatch. Your blood pressure will level off, your heart rate will be at a better pace. It's just good for you.
And it sounds like our body is going to do natural things, and if we're only more aware of what might trigger those reactions, and then we can control what happens after. Like we can't avoid being initially angry or initially shocked or initially confused, but we can control what happens after that. Is that what I'm getting?
Because you'll feel your heart, your body, your mind when you're below the line. You feel that. And so when you just take that pause and breathe and you begin to get curious, you can be more intentional about what will happen next.
And George, I think if you think of it, or if you're listening to this, if you think of the body, the brain, the nervous system as having 2 primary functions, and the first and primary one is to keep you alive. And our brain has not evolved much from, a very long time ago. And so it doesn't really know the difference between a threat to our body, our physical being, and a threat to our ego. And it responds the same way. So if we can recognize, oh, this is when I get defensive, I get angry, I get triggered. To be even this is, I've never done this, but it's just occurring to me now, to be able to say thanks. And let me just pause for a minute, because I think this is a threat to my ego. And if I go off, I will not be able to handle this in the way I'd like to, because when we are highly triggered to defend ourselves, or we get very angry, we actually lose connection to the executive functions in our brain. Oxygen is cut off from them. If you were to put your palms on your head, like on your forehead with the fingers pointing up, when the thumbs are pointing up, you're above the line. You're able to use the prefrontal lobe. You're able to be creative. You have access to empathy, the emotional centers. And if you put your hands behind your head, that's where the reptilian complex, where your fight or flight is, your thumbs are pointing down. You're below the line, and you're not going to have a conversation worth having. And the odds are you're not really in control of those conversations. And research shows that you have a split second. It's about 0.25 seconds to intentionally pause before the amygdala, which is a neural mass in the midbrain, before it hijacks you and throws you into the fight or flight mode. But the more you practice, the bigger that gap gets, and you can train your nervous system to say, oh, this is not a threat to my body. I'm okay.
Now, I'm thinking of a case when it comes to a threat, when there's both a threat to the body and to the ego. And what comes to mind is road rage. Because often there might be a physical threat because someone just pulls in front of you or pulls out in front of you. So there's a physical threat which has now been averted. And now I guess the ego gets in the way after that.
Yes.
And so it sounds like we need to we need to recognize this ego that we carry around and that we think is so fragile, and maybe we need to have a way of protecting our ego, or boosting it, or what can we do with our ego so that we don't feel so threatened?
I think it gets back to it's the questions you ask yourself. It's really asking yourself, where am I? What's going on here? What are the facts? What am I making up? It's those questions that begin to put you in a good place, that you can now move from the conversations with yourself to the conversations with others.
Let's go back to the conversations with others and explore the concept of what you call inquiry, appreciative inquiry.
Mhm.
And so how would that work in a conversation that you're having with another person, another individual?
So if we take appreciative inquiry, and you just kind of deconstruct those two terms, we talked about appreciative, which is above the line, valuing you, adding value. And inquiry is the power of our questions. It's the way we begin to ask questions. So if you and I, George, you and I are in a conversation, one of my favorite appreciative inquiry questions is, tell me what your wishes are. What do you want more of? And listening to that, and then saying, okay, so how might we move forward together? And so it goes back to, we talk about two practices, generative questions and positive framing. The generative questions can bring you into a positive frame.
And in the workplace, how might a leader make better use of that questioning, that appreciative questioning when working with their teams?
George, it's a great question. I think leaders, if they take the time to, again, pause, breathe, and get curious, what is my intention here? Again, the name of your podcast is like spot on, because a leader should be asking, what's my intended message? What am I trying to do when I go out to talk with my employees, or the staff or managers? What's my hope? And what we talk about in the book is that actually is the positive frame. What is it we want to bring about? What's the outcome we're hoping for? That's a positive frame. And then then the question is, how do I engage the people that I'm going to talk with around that? And I think for leaders, so often leaders feel like they need to have the answers and then tell people what to do and get buy-in. They've been rewarded for being great problem solvers and coming up with great ideas. But George, if you think about it, things are so complex now. And there are so many people that work in an organization that have information and pieces of the puzzle that a leader doesn't have. And so by asking and engaging others in the organization, actually in the process of creating that outcome that you're hoping for, the leader is bound to get to a place that would be more creative, more inclusive, potentially more innovative in achieving that outcome, because they're asking questions instead of telling and asking for buy-in. In the world of appreciative inquiry, we say people commit to what they help create. And so you don't have to get buy-in. If you've engaged people in the planning process or in the creativity process, in the forming of a proposal or a project, they're on board because they helped create it from the outset, and they're committed to wanting to make it happen.
And I'm hearing that if you want to build a stronger team, ask more questions and give less commands.
Yes.
Better than feeling, yes.
And now I've also noticed there are some people who speak before they think. And I suppose what would be better is if they actually asked themselves, had a conversation with themselves before they opened their mouth and said, well, what am I trying to convey here? What do I want to accomplish before I start speaking? Not the people who just start talking and they ramble on, and you listen to them, you think, what the heck is he trying to say? Where is he going with this? And what they're missing is that self-questioning. Is that?
Yes.
Absolutely, George. I think you're spot on. It's that, what am I trying to do with my words? Yeah.
Why do you think people do that? Why do you think people talk before they know what they're going to say?
I actually think it's because they're not aware of what we're actually talking about here. They haven't stood back, literally taking that pause and thinking through their behaviors. I just think, and that's a very courageous conversation to have, to think, how can I better communicate? Ask questions. How do I think about, if you have an employee who's late to every meeting, we actually talk about this in our book. Is your intended message to talk about being late to meetings or being on time? Or if you frame it, what makes a high performing team? And if we're going to talk about questions of a high performing team, what will probably come up is let's get there on time. Let's be prepared.
And so I think I noticed as you Jackie, as you went through that, I noticed a reframing of the conversation from "you're late again, you're late, show up on time," to reframe it to, well, hey, what's best for the team?
Right.
Absolutely. And there you go. You just asked another question, George. It's becoming natural for you.
Yeah, I've seen that, or I've read or heard or learned that if you ask the right questions, you'll get better answers. Better questions give better answers anyways.
Yes.
Maybe not right. It's, there's no one right.
Yeah.
I suppose.
There's a better way to ask questions. Yes.
Say that again, Jackie.
There's a better way to ask questions. If I ask you critical questions, so why are you late? What's going on? Whose fault it is? I'm pushing you below the line. And because I'm asking these critical questions, I'm below the line as well. And if you could just pause and breathe and get really curious and say, so let's talk about our meeting time and who came up with this meeting time and what would be a better time for us to meet and how would this work for us and how might we have more productive meetings? How do we best prepare? And then we go into conversations where we're having great meetings.
And tell us a little bit about the book.
Well, the book is it's written with lots of stories from our experiences with clients, with ourselves, with family members. Most of the examples are workplace examples. And it's basically about how to go about having conversations worth having. This notion, our second edition, which just came out, in the second edition, the third chapter is all about how do you tune in and why is that so important? And that's that pause, breathe, and get curious so that you can actually be intentional. Stanford University has said that the number one leadership capability is self-awareness. So if you are aware that your conversations are having an incredible influence on yourself and everyone else, then asking that question of where am I, and being above the line allows you to then be intentional with your conversations. And we introduced two practices. The first one is asking generative questions, and the second one is using a positive frame. And the book is not about being positive. It's not about Pollyanna or anything like that. But when you have conversations worth having, it does generate positivity, even if you're talking about tough conversations or critical issues, or you're needing to correct someone's behavior, or as in the case of the last chapter, talking about life and death situations. So you can turn any conversation into a conversation worth having by asking questions that add value or value what is present.
And I would just add, we have a chapter in there. It's called "It's Not Magic, It's Science." A lot of people think it's magical. Look what's happening to my conversations. Look what's happening to my relationships. But there's a lot of science behind this. I mean, we talked about it earlier in our conversation with you, George. But high performing teens need a ratio of 6-to-1 positivity in their conversations. Relationships are 5-to-1, and Barbara Fredrickson talks about positive emotions 3-to-1 on the positive. So if you find yourself getting down to a 3-to-1 ratio, you need to rethink about the tone and direction. And what we're asking for is a much more appreciative tone that can lead you into a positive direction.
And George, one other thing I just want to add in there, you mentioned Jackie's frame for strategic conversations, SOAR, at the outset. That was a positive way. And our chapter, we have a chapter in the book that also is on how to use scale conversations to the whole organization. And her model is introduced in the book as well.
And let's go to a meeting setting, whether it's live or virtual, where the conversation in the meeting seems to be going in the wrong direction. What might a person in the room who's not the leader, they're not the leader, so they can't just impose their will, what can they say that might help get the conversation back on track?
I'm smiling because if you're on Zoom, you could just mute everybody. But if you're in a room, think about it, because I have been in a room where I've seen two leaders go at each other and just almost saying in a very appreciative way, let's time out. What's our intended message? What are we really trying to do? I hear you and I hear you, but what's the outcome? What are we looking for? And then to say, let's open it up to other people in the room. As Cheri mentioned earlier, we're surfacing assumptions. We're trying to get a shared understanding and not jump into the blame, attack, defend mode, and also not jump into this is how we're going to get out of the problem. Take some time to really explore, is this the real problem? What do we really want to talk about? What is our intended outcome? And then have a conversation around that.
Yeah, I think the beauty of this, George, is that anybody at any level of the organization can always ask a question. And a question can redirect the conversation. Even something as simple as, I wonder what other people in the meeting are thinking about the topic right now. Do you think we could go around and just kind of get a reading in the room, which quickly diffuses and also gives people the opportunity to step in without doing anything to harm the ego of the leader.
Now, it's not always easy to come up with a good question in the moment. So what can a person do to be prepared or armed with better, or at least the thinking to create better questions?
I think if you're new to this, and we have these in our book and on our website, is pick 3 or 4 generative questions that no matter what situation you're in, you can diffuse it, in the sense that I might ask you, so I hear you, George, I hear what you are saying. Let's hear from Cheri. Let's take a moment here from Cheri. What does she think? And then it's like asking what are other people's perspectives, and saying, now that we've talked and dissected the problem, what do we really want to happen? What are your wishes? What do we want more of? And just putting those questions in your vocabulary, they become more natural when you're in really difficult situations.
I also think that it's very easy for us to kind of stay at the surface. We're advocating for our point of view. And I think it's easy to ask a question that starts to dig below that and turn that back and forth into something that's a conversation worth having, by asking, tell me a little bit more about why you see it that way. What do you think the outcomes will be? What do you know that I don't know that I should know that might help me understand more deeply your particular position on this? And that immediately diffuses the defensiveness in the other person, because they're being asked for their opinion and a deeper explanation of their thoughts.
That one appealed to me. What do you know that I don't know? Because what I liked about it is it demonstrates that, hey, there's stuff you know that I don't know, and maybe I'd think the same way that you do if I only knew what you knew.
Exactly.
That's another great generative question. What do you know that I don't know?
That's worth keeping. Yep.
Yes, and I think if for the person who's novice at this, the easiest questions to ask are the questions that help make the visible make the invisible visible. Like, what assumptions am I making? What assumptions is the other person making? What's going on for them? What else might explain their behavior? And asking, like, tell me about that makes the invisible visible. When you say, what do you know that I don't know? What data do you have that supports what you're, just kind of ask questions to broaden the screen of what's visible to everybody. Could be the simplest way to get started on asking generative questions.
Powerful advice. My two guests today are Cheri Torres and Jackie Stavros, reminding you to ask questions that make the invisible visible. If you like what you heard, remember to like, comment, and share this podcast. Come back every week for more practical insights to help you convey your intended message. I'm your host, George Torok.